I never believed in cursed objects, but that changed the day I stumbled upon an old, rusted key buried in my backyard. At first, it seemed ordinary until I turned it in a lock and stepped through a door that wasn't supposed to exist. Behind each door it opened lay a nightmare more horrifying than the last, places where reality twisted and shadows came alive. Now, I'm trapped in a game I never chose to play, and the key won't let me stop. It was a typical Saturday morning when I decided to tidy up my backyard. The sun filtered through the trees, and the air carried a faint scent of earth. As I dug up a stubborn patch of weeds near the old oak tree, my spade struck something metallic. At first, I thought it was just an old bottle cap or a piece of rusted junk. But as I unearthed it, I realized it was a small, ornate key. The key was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Its design was intricate, with delicate carvings that seemed to shimmer faintly in the light. There were symbols etched along its length, symbols I didn't recognize, and the metal felt unusually cold to the touch. I slipped it into my pocket, brushing it off as an odd trinket. That night, as I sat on my couch flipping through channels, a peculiar sensation washed over me. It was as if the room had grown colder, and a faint whisper echoed in my ears. I froze, listening intently, but there was nothing, just the sound of the TV. I convinced myself it was my imagination and went to bed. The real strangeness began the next morning. Every time I walked past my bedroom door, the key in my pocket grew warmer, almost burning against my skin. A compulsion I couldn't explain took hold of me, urging me to try the key on the door. My heart raced as I slid it into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing not my hallway, but an abandoned hospital, shrouded in darkness. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and flickering lights illuminated the dilapidated walls. Shadowy figures moved at the edges of my vision, and a sense of dread wrapped around me, like a vice. Panic surged, and I slammed the door shut, falling back into my familiar hallway. But the key, no matter how hard I tried, would not leave my possession. In the days that followed, the key became an inescapable part of my life. I tried throwing it away, burying it, even burning it, but each time, it inexplicably returned to my pocket. Worse, strange, things started happening. Objects in my house would move on their own, whispers grew louder at night, and shadows lingered in places they shouldn't. One evening, as I sat staring at the key, I noticed something I hadn't before. The symbols etched into it were glowing faintly. It seemed almost alive, pulsing with an eerie light. I turned it over in my hands, studying the markings, when I heard a voice clear, deep, and unmistakable. "The key demands to be used," it said. I spun around, but no one was there. The voice continued, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "7 doors must be opened. Only then will you be free. Refuse and the consequences will follow you into every corner of your life." My mind raced. 7 doors? Free from what? The voice faded, leaving behind only the oppressive silence. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down I knew this wasn't just some bizarre prank. The key had rules, and they had to be followed. Reluctantly, I placed the key in the nearest lock, this time my kitchen door. When it turned, the door opened not into my kitchen but into a dense, otherworldly forest. Stepping through the doorway, I found myself in a forest where the air was unnaturally still. The trees were ancient and twisted, their branches curling like skeletal hands against a starless sky. Time seemed to stand still, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. As I moved deeper into the forest, I began to notice faint laughter, high-pitched and unsettling. Then I saw them, a group of ghostly children, pale and translucent, playing what looked like a game of hide and seek. Their movements were jerky, like marionettes controlled by an unseen force. One of them turned to me, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. "You shouldn't be here," it whispered, its voice echoing unnaturally. Before I could respond, the ground beneath me shifted, and I found myself standing in the center of their game. The children surrounded me, their laughter turning to chants. They Presented a riddle, solve it, and I could leave. Fail, and I would join their game forever. The riddle was maddening, twisting logic and reason into knots. My heart pounded as I worked through it, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, I shouted the answer, and the children stopped, their faces blank and unreadable. "You may go," one of them said, its voice tinged with reluctance. I ran back through the door, slamming it shut behind me. But as I caught my breath, I noticed something new. A faint mark had appeared on my hand, resembling one of the symbols on the 5E. It burned slightly, a constant reminder that this was far from over. Each door I opened would leave its mark, and I had 6 more to go. The 4th door beckoned with an ominous pull, its surface pulsating with a dim, sickly light. As the key clicked into place, I braced myself, half expecting the same unearthly landscapes I'd encountered before. Instead, I stepped into what appeared to be my hometown, but something was deeply, unsettlingly wrong. The streets were eerily silent, lined with buildings that looked half-finished and decaying at the same time. The sky was an ashen gray, and a fog clung to the ground, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I wandered through familiar landmarks twisted into grotesque parodies of themselves. The bakery I'd visited every Sunday was now boarded up, its windows shattered. The park where I used to play as a kid was overrun with vines that seemed to move, as though alive. Then I saw them, figures in the fog. At first I thought they were people I knew, but as they drew closer, my heart sank. Their faces were distorted, stretched into unnatural shapes, with empty eyes that glowed faintly in the murk. One of them looked like my childhood best friend, Daniel. But it wasn't him, at least. Not anymore. "Help me," the twisted version of Daniel whispered, his voice layered with anguish and malice. His body jerked toward me like a marionette, limbs moving at impossible angles. I stumbled back, horrified, as more figures emerged, each bearing the twisted likeness of someone I once loved. That's when I felt it, a presence, watching me. I turned to see a tall, shadowy figure in the distance, its eyes 2 pinpricks of red light. It moved silently, gliding rather than walking, and wherever it passed, the fog seemed to thicken. I didn't need to be told who or what it was. This was the caretaker of the key, and it was hunting me. I ran, the twisted figures lurching after me. The caretaker's form loomed ever closer, its shape seeming to shift and stretch as it pursued me through the decayed streets. I found a door, a plain, unmarked one that seemed to vibrate with an energy I recognized as the key's doing. With shaking hands, I unlocked it and threw myself through, slamming it shut behind me. My chest heaved as I leaned against the door, realizing that I had narrowly escaped, but the caretaker wasn't done with me yet. By the time I reached the 5th door, I was already feeling the toll the key had taken on me. Each time I used it, I lost something. At first it was subtle, a memory here, a fleeting thought there, but now the losses were undeniable. I woke up one morning and couldn't remember my mother's face. Her name slipped away like sand through my fingers, leaving behind only the knowledge that she had existed. My reflection in the mirror looked foreign, as though I were staring at a stranger. Worse still, I noticed my hands trembling, my movements slower, as if the key were siphoning away my very vitality. The 5th door was particularly cruel. When it opened, I found myself in what looked like a grand library, its shelves stretching endlessly into darkness. Books floated in midair, their pages turning on their own. As I walked through the labyrinth of bookshelves, I came across a journal, resting on a pedestal. The leather cover was cracked and ancient, and the writing inside was in a language I didn't understand at first. As I flipped through its pages, the text began to shift, transforming into something legible. The journal spoke of the key's origin, forged by a desperate blacksmith who sought to cheat death. But the key came with a curse. For every door it opened, it demanded a price. The journal also revealed that I was not the first to bear this burden. It mentioned previous holders, each of whom had tried and failed to escape the curse. One passage stood out. The key takes what you cherish most. Beware the 13th door, for it holds your final reckoning. Before I could read more, the books around me began to tremble, their pages tearing free and swirling into a storm of paper. I barely escaped back through the door, clutching the journal, its final pages burned into my mind. By the time I reached the final door, I was a shadow of who I once was. The key had taken so much my memories, my strength, even my sense of self. I barely recognized my own reflection, and my mind felt like a patchwork of fading thoughts. The last door stood before me, unlike any of the others. It was massive, its surface etched with the same symbols as the key, but glowing brighter, pulsing like a heartbeat. As I placed the key into the lock, I hesitated, my hand trembling. The journal's warning echoed in my mind, beware. The 13th door. Before I could turn the key, I heard a voice behind me. Turning, I saw a man, or what was left of him. His skin was pale, stretched thin over his bones, and his eyes were hollow pits. He introduced himself as a previous key holder, one who had failed to complete the sequence. He begged me not to open the door, claiming that freedom was a lie. But I couldn't stop. The key had to be used. Together we devised a plan to outsmart the curse. As I turned the key and stepped through, I was met with a realm of blinding light and shadow, where the caretaker waited for me. The final confrontation was unlike anything I had faced before, a battle of will, memory, and sacrifice. In the end, I had to confront the deepest parts of myself, the pieces I had lost, and decide whether to claim my freedom or succumb to the key's power. The 7th door had barely shut behind me when I felt it, a chilling presence unlike any I'd encountered before. The air grew dense, and shadows stretched unnaturally long, gathering in the center of the room. From the darkness, a figure emerged, tall, cloaked, and featureless save for 2 glowing yellow eyes. It wasn't the caretaker, but something else entirely. It radiated power and menace, its voice a low, guttural rumble that seemed to resonate within my chest. You've carried the key long enough, it said. I can take it from you, but the price will be steep. I froze, clutching the key in my trembling hand. What kind of price? I managed to whisper. The figure stepped closer, and the shadows around me seemed to writhe. Freedom always demands sacrifice. Someone you love must take your place. Their life, their soul, their torment, it will be theirs to bear. Or you can continue, alone. The weight of the choice hit me like a tidal wave. The thought of condemning someone I cared about to this nightmare was unthinkable. But the alternative, facing the remaining doors on my own, felt equally impossible. As I hesitated, the figure gestured, and suddenly images of my family and friends appeared around me, distorted and flickering like a broken projection. The figure's voice grew insistent. Choose now, or the key will decide for you. Before I could answer, the doors in the room began to creak and groan. One after another they burst open, revealing glimpses of horrifying realms, swirling voids, endless mazes, and hellish landscapes. I screamed as unseen forces dragged me toward the nearest door, and the figures' laughter echoed in my ears. I had made no choice, and yet the key had made one for me. When I awoke, I found myself in a corridor lined with doors on either side. Each door looked identical, save for faint, glowing symbols etched into their surfaces. The air was heavy with tension, and I could feel the oppressive weight of unseen eyes watching my every move. It was then that I realized this was no longer about individual doors. I was in a labyrinth, and I had to find my way through. As I walked, I studied the symbols, trying to decipher their meaning. Some glowed brighter than others, and I had a gut feeling that the order mattered. I opened the first door cautiously, stepping into a room where time seemed to move backward. The walls pulsed with shifting light, and objects floated in reverse. I made it through by sheer instinct, but the second door wasn't so forgiving. Behind it was a realm where gravity worked sideways, and every step felt like I was walking on the razor's edge. I narrowly avoided falling into an endless abyss, and when I finally stumbled back into the corridor, I was greeted by someone I didn't expect, a fellow traveler. She was older than me, her face lined with exhaustion and fear. She introduced herself as Lydia, another victim of the key's curse. Unlike me, she claimed to have been navigating the labyrinth for years. "There's an order to the doors," she said, her voice shaky but firm. "Get it wrong, and the labyrinth resets, dragging you back to the start." Together, we worked to decipher the symbols. Her knowledge was invaluable, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was holding something back. As we progressed, the challenges grew. More twisted realms where time looped endlessly, where logic broke down, and where even the air seemed to claw at our sanity. It wasn't long before Lydia revealed her true motive. She wasn't helping me out of kindness, she was hoping to use me to escape. "Only one of us can leave," she admitted, her voice tinged with guilt. "And I've been here too long." The realization hit me hard. The labyrinth wasn't just testing my resolve, it was turning us against each other. Eventually, the labyrinth led me to a room unlike any other. It was dark and cavernous, with a single pedestal in the center. On it rested an ancient book, its pages glowing faintly. As I approached, visions began to flood my mind, flashes of a life that wasn't mine but felt intimately familiar. The visions revealed the key's origin. Centuries ago, a blacksmith in a cursed village forged the key in a desperate bid to save his family. The village had been struck by plague, and the blacksmith, a man named Elias, had sought out forbidden knowledge. Using ancient rituals, he imbued the key with the power to unlock any door, including the door to death itself. But Elias had underestimated the cost of such power. The key became cursed, binding itself to its creator and turning every door into a reflection of his sins. Each realm represented a transgression, a lie told, a betrayal enacted, a life taken. The more doors Elias opened, the deeper the curse rooted itself, until it claimed his soul entirely. The final vision showed Elias screaming as the caretaker took his body, turning him into the first keeper of the key. The curse passed from one holder to the next, each trapped in an endless cycle of torment and desperation. When the vision ended, I was left trembling. The book's final page bore a single, ominous line. "To end the curse, you must confront the sins that forged it." I understood then that the key wasn't just a tool or a curse, it was a legacy of guilt and pain. And I was now part of its story. If I wanted to escape, I would have to face the darkest parts of its past and myself. The 13th door loomed before me, a monolith of black iron pulsing faintly as though alive. The key trembled in my hand, a desperate warning I was too broken to heed. My body felt like it wasn't my own anymore. Every step toward the door dragged me deeper into despair. Behind this door lay the truth, the final horror, and my only chance at freedom. With a deep breath, I slid the key into the lock. The sound of it turning echoed like a death knell. The door swung open, revealing nothing. A void stretched before me, an infinite, suffocating darkness. Then the whispers began. They came from everywhere and nowhere, rising in a cacophony of voices that made my ears bleed. Each whisper carried pieces of my past moments I had buried, sins I had denied. I tried to shut them out, but they were inside me, clawing at my thoughts, peeling back the layers of my mind. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, a shadow shifting in the void. But as it moved closer, its form became clearer, and my breath caught in my throat. It was me, or rather, something wearing my face. Its eyes were pits of emptiness, its grin stretched unnaturally wide, revealing rows of jagged, inhuman teeth. It stared at me with a hunger that sent ice through my veins. Finally, it said, its voice a distorted mockery of my own, "You've come home." The realization struck me like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't just another nightmare. This was me. The creature stepped forward, mirroring my every movement, each step stealing the strength from my body. I stumbled back, but the void seemed to close in around me, binding me in place. "You've been here before," it whispered, tilting its head in mock pity. "Every time you think you can escape, every time you fail." Memories surged through me, flashes of lives I couldn't have lived, faces I couldn't have known. Each one ended the same way: me, standing before this door, facing this thing, and losing. Over and over, the cycle repeated, and now it was happening again. "I'll take it from here," it said, reaching out a clawed hand. "You've carried the burden long enough." I tried to scream, to fight, but my body wouldn't obey. Its hand plunged into my chest, and a cold, so intense it burned, flooded through me. My vision blurred, my thoughts fragmented, and then, nothing. When I awoke, I was standing in my hallway, the key heavy in my hand. My heart raced as I spun around, but the door was gone. Everything looked normal, but I knew better. The weight of the key in my pocket felt heavier now, like an anchor tied to my soul. I wasn't free. I was back, where I started. But something was different this time. I looked into the mirror across the hall and froze. My reflection stared back at me with empty, hollow eyes, its mouth curling into a smile that wasn't mine. The whispers returned, faint but unmistakable, crawling into my ears like spiders. The key grew warm, pulsing softly against my leg. I reached for it instinctively, but my reflection moved on its own, holding up its own version of the key. It turned toward me and spoke, its voice dripping with malice. "You're next." I threw the key onto the floor, but it didn't matter. It was already inside me, part of me. I could feel the doors waiting, lurking in the shadows of my mind, eager to be opened again. And I knew that soon, whether I wanted to or not, I would have to use it. Or maybe you will. Because the key doesn't stop. It finds the next bearer, the next victim, the next fool who dares to. So check. Are you sure you're alone right now? Are you certain you don't hear the faint sound of whispers growing louder behind you? If you've made it this far, the story is already with you. It lingers like the key, waiting to unlock something you don't want to see. Share this story if you dare. But remember, every retelling brings it closer to reality. Now ask yourself, are you truly safe, or is something watching from the door? I've lived in this house for 10 years, and I know every inch of it, or at least I thought I did. Yesterday, while clearing out the attic, I discovered something that shouldn't exist: a door. It wasn't there before, and yet it looked ancient, its surface covered in scratches and symbols I couldn't recognize. When I pressed my ear against it, I heard faint whispers, voices that didn't sound human. I should have walked away, but something about that door wouldn't let me. The door appeared without warning, an anomaly that defied every logical explanation. Nestled in the far corner of the attic, it stood out starkly against the wooden walls, its surface ancient, cracked and covered with cryptic carvings. I hadn't noticed it before, not in all the years I had spent storing old boxes and forgotten memories up there. But now, it was impossible to ignore. My curiosity quickly turned to unease. The symbols on the door felt alive, their patterns shifting slightly when I looked away, as if they were trying to tell me something. I reached out to touch one, and the wood beneath my fingertips felt unnaturally cold. The sensation lingered, a dull ache be spreading up my arm, and I pulled back instinctively. Later that evening, I decided to dig through some of the belongings left by the previous owner, an elderly man named Mr. Hargrove. He had passed away several years ago, leaving behind a collection of books, furniture, and an old journal I hadn't paid much attention to until now. The journal was bound in leather and smelled faintly of mildew, but its pages were filled with scrawled entries that spoke of strange dreams, ominous symbols, and a door that didn't belong. Hargrove's words were a frantic jumble, a descent into paranoia as he described a ritual to keep the door sealed. He wrote of offerings, candles, chants, and the placement of salt to form a barrier. The symbols on the door matched those sketched in the journal, and a final warning was scrawled in bold, shaky letters: do not open it. The seal is fragile. The horror behind it is eternal. Despite the clear warning, I couldn't stop thinking about the door. It called to me, a quiet hum in the back of my mind. One night, driven by an irresistible compulsion, I unlocked it. The moment the door creaked open, an icy wind rushed past me, carrying with it a deep, guttural growl. Shadows erupted from the opening, taking shape as long, sinewy forms with glowing red eyes. Something ancient had been waiting behind that door, and I had just set it free. The whispers began the moment I closed the attic door behind me. At first they were faint, indistinct murmurs I dismissed as the house settling or the wind brushing against the eaves. As the nights passed, the voices grew louder, their tone shifting from incoherent babble to something almost conversational. They called my name, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. Sleep became impossible. Every time I drifted off, I dreamed of the door. In my dreams, it stood open, revealing a long, dark corridor lined with doors on either side. The whispers filled the air, taunting me with words I couldn't quite understand. When I woke, the whispers lingered, following me into my waking hours. They echoed in the empty rooms of the house, growing louder whenever I approached the attic. By the fifth night, I couldn't take it anymore. Armed with a flashlight and trembling with fear, I returned to the attic. The door was waiting, its symbols glowing faintly in the dark. The whispers were deafening now, urging me to open it, promising answers to questions I hadn't asked. When I turned the handle, the air grew heavy, and the door swung open with a groan. Beyond it lay the corridor from my dreams, stretching endlessly into the distance. I stepped through, the whispers surrounding me like a living thing. The shadows along the walls twisted and writhed, forming humanoid shapes with hollow eyes and skeletal hands. Each figure seemed to know me. They whispered my deepest regrets, my darkest fears, and the moments I had tried hardest to forget. I couldn't run. The further I went, the more they crowded me, their cold hands brushing against my skin. I realized then that this wasn't just a corridor, it was a manifestation of my guilt, a realm where every secret I had buried came alive to haunt me. After the horrors of the corridor, I slammed the door shut and swore never to touch it again. But the attic had other plans. The door refused to disappear, and its whispers seeped into every corner of my life. One night, I returned to find it ajar. This time it opened not to a corridor, but to a room, a child's bedroom, perfectly preserved. The room was eerily cheerful. A small bed with a patchwork quilt sat in one corner, surrounded by shelves of toys and books. The walls were painted a pale blue, adorned with drawings that seemed oddly familiar. I stepped inside and felt a chill that didn't match the room's cozy appearance. As I examined the drawings, my heart stopped. They were scenes from my childhood, my first bicycle, the house I grew up in, and the tree where I used to play. But these drawings were old. The paper yellowed with age. It was impossible, yet there they were. On the desk sat a photo album filled with pictures of me as a child. Only the person standing beside me in the photos wasn't anyone I recognized. The longer I stayed in the room, the more I felt watched. The air grew heavy, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. I tried to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. The toys seemed to shift slightly, turning toward me as if they had minds of their own. When I finally escaped, slamming the door behind me, I realized the room wasn't just a portal. It was alive, watching me, recording my every move. And now, it knew who I was. It started subtly. The door in the attic seemed to radiate a presence, a quiet hum that I could feel in my bones. I avoided it for days, but it didn't matter. The door had marked me. The whispers that had begun as faint murmurs were now distinct voices, and my name was their favorite refrain. The house itself had begun to turn on me. Mirrors in the bathroom cracked without warning, their fractures forming intricate patterns that seemed to mimic the carvings on the door. The walls bled thick, dark streaks that disappeared as soon as I tried to clean them. And every night, I felt eyes watching me. One night, the air in the attic grew impossibly cold, and the whispers fell silent. I should have felt relief, but instead, an overwhelming sense of dread crept over me. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a figure standing in its frame. It was made of shadows, its form constantly shifting, as if the darkness itself was alive. Two glowing eyes pierced through the void, fixing me, with a gaze that pinned me in place. "I can offer you what you desire most," it said, its voice like dry leaves scraping across stone. "Open the door fully, and it will be yours." I wanted to refuse, to flee, but I couldn't move. "What's the price?" I managed to whisper. The figure laughed, a hollow sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You'll see." The whispers returned after that night, louder and more insistent. Shadows moved on their own, and the house seemed to breathe with malicious intent. I couldn't take it anymore. Driven to the brink of madness, I accepted the bargain. The figure stepped aside as I opened the door, revealing not darkness, but a vision of my deepest desire, my younger brother, alive again, standing at the edge of a sunlit meadow. I stepped through, tears streaming down my face. But the moment I reached for him, the vision shattered. The meadow turned to ash, my brother's face twisted into a grotesque grin, and the figure from the door loomed above me. "Desire," it said, "is always a trap." When I awoke, I was back in the attic, but I wasn't the same. The door was gone, replaced by a mirror. My reflection grinned at me, though I hadn't moved. The house had claimed me, and now it was hungry for more. The storm hit with a ferocity I hadn't seen in years, rain lashing against the windows and lightning illuminating the attic in staccato bursts. I had been drawn to the door again, unable to resist its pull. This time I made a mistake. I opened it without thinking, and the world shifted. The house groaned as if in pain, the lights flickering and dying. When I looked outside, the sky was no longer the stormy gray I'd expected. Instead, it was black, a darkness so complete that no stars or moon pierced it. The rain was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. Time felt wrong, stretched and distorted. I quickly realized I wasn't alone. From the attic, I could hear something moving below. At first, it was just faint scratching, but soon it became heavy footsteps, circling the rooms beneath me. I tried to close the door, but it wouldn't budge. The air around it seemed to solidify, trapping me in this twisted version of my home. When I ventured downstairs, I saw them creatures stalking through the house. Their forms were hunched and grotesque, their skin a mottled gray that seemed to shimmer in the faint light. They moved as though they didn't belong in this world, their limbs jerking unnaturally. I hid, holding my breath as one passed by, its hollow eyes scanning the darkness. The attic was my only sanctuary, but even there, I wasn't safe. The door remained open, revealing glimpses of another world, shifting landscapes, endless corridors and shadowy figures that watched but never moved. I tried to fight to close the door, but every attempt only seemed to draw the creatures closer. I realized the truth too late. The door wasn't a portal to another world, it was a trap to bring their world into mine. The door had been silent for weeks. I dared to hope that whatever haunted it had finally left. But one night, as I lay in bed, I heard footsteps in the attic. Soft, deliberate, too human to belong to the creatures I'd seen before. When I investigated, I saw her, a ghostly figure, pale and flickering, standing before the door. She turned to me, her eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice echoing faintly. I froze. "Who are you?" She told me her story in fragmented whispers. She had lived in the house decades ago, long before I moved in. Like me, she had found the door and been drawn to it. She ignored its warnings, opened it, and stepped through. I thought I could handle what was beyond, she said, her voice breaking. But I was wrong. Now I'm trapped, caught between this world and theirs. She begged me not to open it, to leave the house and never return. But the door seemed to have a will of its own. As I stared at it, the symbols began to glow, and the whispers grew louder. Against her protests, I reached for the handle. The ghost screamed, lunging at me, but her translucent form passed through my hand. The door swung open, revealing a vision so horrifying that my mind refused to fully process it. A vast, roiling landscape of shadows and writhing figures, their faces distorted in eternal agony. The ghost's final words echoed as I was pulled inside. You'll become one of us. Now, I stand on the other side of the door, watching through the cracks as someone else explores the attic. They'll see the door soon, just as I did. And when they open it, I'll be waiting. The first time I stepped through the door, it was purely out of desperation. The whispers had grown unbearable, a constant drone in my head that I couldn't escape. When the door opened, I expected terror. What I found instead was a peculiar sense of calm at first. I was back in my living room, sitting on the couch with a cup of coffee in my hand. Morning. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and everything felt eerily normal. I almost convinced myself it had been a dream. But then, the first sign appeared. The clock on the wall was stuck, its second hand jerking back and forth between two positions. I tried to ignore it, but as the day unfolded, small anomalies began to pile up. The phone rang, endlessly, but no one was there when I answered. The shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch and writhe, even when nothing moved. And when I walked into the kitchen to grab lunch, I was back in the living room again, coffee in hand, the clock stuck in the same position. The realization hit me like a brick. I was trapped, living the same day over and over. Each loop was slightly different. The first time I heard faint knocking at the attic door. The second time, the knocking turned into scraping, as if something was trying to claw its way out. By the fifth loop, I began hearing my name whispered in every corner of the house. The only way out, I realized, lay in the attic. With every loop, the door seemed to change, its symbols glowing brighter, its surface pulsing like a living thing. I found clues in each loop, fragments of a puzzle hidden in the mundane details of the day. A line in a book, a sequence of numbers on the clock, a phrase whispered in the static of the radio. Piece by piece, I unraveled. The door's purpose, it wasn't just a gateway. It was a prison, meant to trap something or someone forever. But before I could solve the puzzle, I began to feel it, something stalking me through the loops. At first, it was just a fleeting shadow at the edge of my vision. Then, it began appearing closer. A grotesque figure with hollow eyes and elongated limbs. Each loop brought it closer until I could feel its breath on my neck. The door wasn't just a trap for me. It had also set something loose. After one particularly harrowing loop, I woke up to find the door sealed shut. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. That morning, as I showered, I noticed a faint mark on my forearm, an intricate symbol that looked eerily like the carvings on the door. It was small at first, almost imperceptible. But by evening, it had spread, curling up my arm like a vine. The marks weren't just visual, they burned, a searing pain that intensified whenever I was near the attic. And with each passing hour, visions began to plague me. At first, they came as flashes of barren, ash-gray wasteland where figures writhed in agony. Soon, the visions became more vivid, dragging me into that desolate world even while I was awake. I'd blink, and suddenly, I was standing in that lifeless expanse, the air thick with ash and the cries of the damned. The marks grew with alarming speed, creeping across my skin until they covered nearly my entire body. Each new symbol brought with it a new piece of the vision, glimpses of the door's origin, of the entity that dwelled behind it, waiting to consume me. One night, as I lay awake, the attic door opened on its own. The room filled with the hum of energy, and I felt myself being pulled toward it. The door was no longer waiting for me to act it. It was demanding it. Unless I broke the curse, I knew it would drag me through, body and soul, into the world of endless suffering I had glimpsed. On the night I decided I couldn't take it anymore, a knock came at the front door. Standing there was a stranger, tall, gaunt, with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of sorrow. He introduced himself simply as the keeper and held out an old iron key. This, he said, is the only way to end it, but it comes at a price. The keeper explained that the key would unlock the attic door completely, opening it to its full potential. But doing so would bind me to the door's curse in a way I couldn't yet comprehend. Every choice you make beyond that threshold will determine not just your fate, but the fates of those who come after you. Desperate and exhausted, I took the key. When I unlocked the door, the world shifted. I found myself in a labyrinth of endless doors, each one leading to a different horrifying reality. In one, I walked through a house where every mirror reflected not me, but the twisted creature stalking me through the loops. In another, I stood in a room filled with doppelgangers of myself, each one whispering the same phrase over and over: "You chose this." The keeper's voice echoed in my head as I stumbled through the maze. The door doesn't end. It only begins again. The final choice was clear: to close the door behind me and accept my fate, or to leave it open, knowing it would claim another. My hand trembled on the handle as I realized the truth. There was no true escape. The door would always be there, waiting. As I stood frozen, I heard footsteps behind me. Someone else was approaching the attic. A new victim. Or perhaps you. The attic felt alive now. The air pulsed, heavy and electric, as if the house itself had a heartbeat. I stood before the door, clutching the old will I had found in the dusty trunk, my family's cursed legacy, passed down from one doomed soul to the next. The truth was inescapable. The door wasn't just a family secret, it was a sentence, a punishment forged in the sins of my ancestors. It was the next link in a chain that had stretched through generations. The symbols on the door glowed brighter as I approached, pulsing in rhythm with the pounding in my chest. The whispers were deafening now, each one a voice I recognized: my mother, my grandmother, my great-uncle. All of them had been here before me, and all of them had failed. To break the cycle, they pleaded in voices warped by despair. But beware, it's waiting. I slid the key into the lock, every nerve in my body screaming at me to stop. The door swung, opened slowly, revealing nothing but darkness, a vast, endless void. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that was somehow worse. I felt it before I saw it: an immense presence lurking just beyond the threshold. It wasn't something I could see with my eyes, but rather something I felt, a weight pressing on my soul. Then it stepped forward. It was impossibly tall, its form shifting and indistinct, like smoke given shape. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its face, if it had one, was a swirling mass of shadows that seemed to devour the light. It spoke, but not in words. Its voice was a vibration that tore through my body, shaking me to my core. "You are mine," it said, though the words were more an idea forced into my mind. "You always have been." I tried to back away, but the door frame held me in place, its edges curling like fingers to trap me. The figure reached out, and I felt its touch, not on my skin, but deep within me, an icy grip on my very essence. Memories flashed before my eyes, not just my own, but those of my ancestors. Each one had stood where I stood now, and each had been consumed. "This is your inheritance," the thing whispered. "The sins of your bloodline are now your burden." I screamed, trying to pull free, but it was useless. The void began to close around me, swallowing the room, the house, the world. I was falling, tumbling into an abyss that felt eternal. And just as the last sliver of light faded, I heard it: laughter, soft, cruel, and echoing endlessly. When I woke, I was in the attic again. The door was gone, but its presence lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. My reflection in the attic window was not my own. The face staring back at me was hollow, its eyes glowing faintly with that same sickly yellow light. I blinked, and the reflection smiled a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far. I turned and ran, but no matter where I went, the house seemed smaller, the walls closing in. Every door I opened led back to the attic, to that same cursed space where it had all begun. The whispers had returned, louder than ever, and this time they weren't pleading, they were laughing. The house wanted me to know one thing: there was no escape. I'm still here, trapped in the house, though I don't know how long it's been. Days? Weeks? Time? It has no meaning anymore. The door may be gone, but I can feel it watching, waiting, sometimes. I hear footsteps on the stairs or the sound of a key turning in a lock that doesn't exist. It's looking for someone new. Maybe it will find you. You've read my story, and now you know the truth. The door isn't just in my house, it's in every house. It waits in the forgotten places: the attic, the basement, the hidden corners of your mind. If you dare, share this story. But remember, every retelling brings it closer. It closer. Are you sure your doors are where they're supposed to be? Or is there one you haven't noticed yet, one that wasn't there yesterday?